Hello, everyone. Welcome to the PMPC session dedicated to clinical trials in pediatric oncology. My name is Anna Valainen. I'm a pediatric hemato-oncologist here in Riga, and I'm chairing this session together with Mr. Gilles Wassal from the Gustave Rousseau Comprehensive Cancer Center in France. Pediatric cancer is unique for the high prevalence and high importance of clinical trials in this field. Clinical trials have been driving forward the development of cancer treatment and have been very successful in improving survival and long-term life quality for pediatric cancer patients. It has driven the research into not imaginable areas that we are in today. So we will hear about this in this session as well. However, clinical research, clinical trials are very resource intense. So in one point, it drives the benchmark higher and higher for diagnostics, for opportunities, for availability to medicaments, but this is not equally so across Europe. There is a European Commission initiative, European Cancer Inequalities Registry, which has gathered data that in the last 10 years across Europe there have been around 400 plus clinical trials open. But not in every European country. Every child has access to these clinical trials. In fact, there are countries where over 50% of all these trials are available, and there are countries where there are none available. So this, again, underscores the difficulties that you face if you have clinical trials open, but maybe you don't have all the opportunities in your country. So this is a broad topic, and we want to hear about these inequalities, why they occur, what are the hurdles, what it takes to have clinical trials, and what is possible. So therefore, we have great speakers today, and I will first invite Dr. Gilles Wassal to give a talk about the inequalities in access to clinical trials, the innovations for children and adolescents with cancer in Europe. The stage is yours, please.
Good morning. So, Anna just described that clinical trials is an integrated part of the care we give to children and an important activities explaining why the cure rate of children and adolescents with cancer moved from less than 40% in the 60s to up to 80% in most countries, high-income countries. So, as you highlighted, there is information on the European Cancer Inequality Registries, and these data are coming from a program run by SIOP, and I would like to share with you the results of this. We wanted to look at the inequalities in access to clinical trials for children and adolescents with cancer across Europe. And this was the Ocean Research Project. Okay, does it work? No. Oops. Whoops. There is no clear button to push the slide forward. I have a laser. I have a back. Okay, but this is not me. But that's okay. That's okay. The essential is that the slides are moving. So just to remind you that clearly, okay, so may I have the next slide, please? Yes, you all know there is a European Beating Cancer Plan up and running since March 2020, which clearly highlighted the needs of children and adolescents with cancer, but a direct flagship program to create in Europe a network of comprehensive cancer centers in each member state that would take part treatment and doing research for 90% of patients by 2030. And this is an ongoing project called EU NetCCC that you may have heard about. in parallel, there is a flagship program in the BT Cancer brand to really access to early diagnosis and quality treatment through this network, really to implement this in partnership with the European Reference Network. And we wanted to show how care and research is delivered at the moment in Europe, and how to figure out to improve the capability in Europe to better provide access to all patients, for all patients to early diagnosis and quality treatment. And the goal was really to show what's happening and maybe to figure out that the way care and research is delivered in adults is not exactly the same way that cancer care and treatment is delivered in children. And highlighting the point that the clear message that the network of comprehensive cancer centers should integrate patients with children and adolescents with cancer might not be exactly the right thing from scratch. So we run the Ocean project, and I think I tried to move. Yes. So the Ocean project was developed to really describe how care and research is delivered. It was really considering the first objective of the SIOP Europe strategic plan, which is equal access to standard of care, expertise, and clinical research for diagnosis, treatment, and follow-up across Europe. And part of this has been done in the uncan.eu project that was run 2 years ago. We surveyed 27 EU member states plus 11 non-EU countries I describe in this map. We identify then that in Europe, in the 27 plus 11, there are 385 centers in these 37 countries delivering care for children with cancer. Among them, only 18 are cancer centers treating both adults and children and only devoted to cancer patients. Which means that the vast majority of centers in Europe taking care of children and adolescents with cancer are in general hospital or pediatric hospital. And immediately you say, so the network of comprehensive cancer center may not be really superimposable to these centers. If we look only at the EU plus Norway and Iceland, this is 282 centers with 16 cancer centers. And there is 1 to 60 centers per country with a median of 4. And 10 countries have only 1 center. This is the network in Europe taking care of children and adolescents with cancer. And only a very small part is in so-called cancer center. If we look at the European Reference Network on pediatric cancer, and this is one of the 24 reference networks, 80 of these 282 are full members of the ERN PETCAN, which is clearly showing that ERN PETCAN is including in the network, but the network is broader. So the goal of the research part was really to describe the landscape of clinical trials in Europe, show inequalities and propose solutions. So what we did, we extracted information from the clinicaltrial.gov database through the keywords of cancer, child, and interventional study in a period running from 2010 to 2022, and looking where these trials were available in Europe. Of course, we wanted to describe access to clinical trial for patients, but this is something impossible to do. To figure out how many patients in each country do participate to a clinical trial, it's a nightmare or even not feasible objective. So we considered a surrogate marker, which is, okay, to get access, then the trial should be open in the country. So we are presenting availability of clinical trial rather than, strictly speaking, access to clinical trial for patients. But we believe that it was already a quite useful information, and I wanted just to summarize this for you. So we identified 2,861 records according to, and after curating, after modifying, after getting rid of it, we came up with 436 pediatric cancer-directed clinical trial running from 2010 from 2022.
out of these 436, 55% were academic trial, and 45% were industry. That was for me a surprise, because I thought it would be less industry trial. But interestingly, if you look at the only pediatric-only trial was about half, and half are mixed adult and for children and adolescents, really explaining the fact that there is more industry trial than we would have expected. When we look at what are the conditions of these 436 trials that were up and running in Europe from 2010 to 2022, 40% for solid tumors, 35% for hematological malignancies, only 13% for brain tumors, and a few as agnostic, the so-called agnostic development, and 6% mixed. So clearly, the CNS field is really less addressed in terms of clinical trial during this period. When we look where the trials were up and running, as a whole, about 3/4 were either international or European trial. This is on the left-hand side. And few were monocentric or national. When we look at academic trial, well, the vast majority were monocentric or national. When we look at the industry trial, 84% were international, which makes sense. But we have still a lot of small trials up running in this period, while clearly the strong message is that clinical trials in pediatric oncology should be European or international. We look at the evolution over time, and as you can see over time, it was a little bit increasing from the first part to the second part. Regarding academic trial, it was really up and down per year, opening, this is a number of open trial in the year, but rather stable over time. Interestingly, when we look at the industry trial, there was a clearly significant increase over time in opening pediatric cancer trial. And this is interesting. I remind you that in 2007, the pediatric regulation was launched. And this is the start of obligation for the companies to develop the medicine in children, even though there are still some waivers which are not relevant. But then the pediatric investigation plan is a phase 1, a phase 2, a phase 3 trial that may end up with data for a marketing authorization. So then we saw, over time, an increase of industry trial, while on the same time, there is a rather stable number of academic trials. When we look at early phase versus late phase, in the left-hand side, these are the academic trials. And yeah, you can see it's rather stable over time, even though there are some fluctuation from year to year. Interestingly, in the industry trial part, where clearly you saw the early phase trial increasing, clearly there has been a delay in the phase 3 trials, because clearly there was a need to finish the phase 1 trial to stop the phase 3 trials. So again, we see here an impact of the pediatric regulation, even though there are still major issues in the implementation of the pediatric regulation, while clearly in the academic trial is rather stable over time. The main question was really, what are the inequalities in Europe? And this came up when we look at how many of these 436 trials were open in each country. And you see in this map a very clear message. There is a huge inequalities across Europe. You have countries such as France, Spain, Italy, Germany, and UK, with from 35 to 50% of this trial open. And these countries have really set up infrastructure programs really to support especially the academic institutional development of this trial. On the other hand, you see all the other countries with no trials, this is what you were mentioning, Anna, or few trials, which is clearly showing the huge inequalities looking at this period. Of course, this is from clinicaltrial.gov, but I think it's already give a clear message to the Europe. There are inequalities in availability of pediatric trial for children. It doesn't mean that all the 436 should be open in all the 282 centers, of course not. But we need to figure out how really to address this part of Europe, really to provide capability to run trial in the country and or to reinforce access to trial outside of the country. So this is a key message that we are pushing forward at the moment at the European level to tell them, hey guys, we need to do something to address this. So what are the current proposed solutions? So in summary, huge inequalities, just described in terms of conclusion. So what are the proposed solutions? The proposed solution is to create comprehensive childhood cancer infrastructures, to identify the concept of centers, working with shared care centers, to really facilitate the translation from research to clinics and to increase the capability to run clinical trials. And we believe that this cannot be only done in the network of comprehensive cancer centers that I was mentioning at the beginning. We propose that these infrastructures are embedded in the European reference network, because this center will work if it is really connecting with the entire network, really to facilitate access to patients in this center and developing the clinical trials. Of course, these centers and the European PETCAN will work with the adult European Comprehensive Cancer Center, because clearly the capabilities, the knowledge and so on will be there. But clearly the goal is to tell we need specific infrastructure in our pediatric oncology network to really leverage the capability to provide access to innovation and run clinical trials. And this should be a joint EU and member state initiative. And this is important. And clearly from the discussion we had seen yesterday, clearly there is a momentum in Riga with the AI, with the data, with the clinical trial unit. And I think this is this vision. But the vision is we need to leverage the capability of the pediatric oncology network in Europe to run this program, including clinical trial and access to innovation. The second objective is to amplify twinning program, because clearly twinning institution, and I heard that there's a twinning program in between Riga and PMC, which is exactly an example how we to facilitate the implementation for this patient. The third objective is to support the academic clinical trial networks really for opening. For me, it's a nonsense that some of the ongoing European clinical trial network, academic network, asking questions in the phase 3 setting in newly diagnosed patients that are not easily available in some of the countries on the left-hand side. We need a modification of the cross-border healthcare directive. You know that in Europe, since maybe 10, 15 years, there is this directive telling any citizen in Europe who needs a treatment which is not available in his or her country should be entitled to receive this in another country, cross-border. And you know there is a specific mechanism called S2, which provides the insurance for the patient in the country to pay for the treatment outside the country. It's a complex thing. It works not completely well, but clearly this directive says it cannot address experimental treatment. So a child to move from, let's say, Romania to Roma, where the only GD2 CAR T-cell program for neuroblastoma patient is up and running, which is an academic trial, cannot be, from this cross-border, covered by the S2. This is what we need to see modified. And this is why SciUp Europe at the moment is really building the evidence of what it is cross-border, what it is the access to clinical trial. And clearly I can tell you that the European Parliament, the member of the Parliament, really are willing in 2026 to address this topic, how to make this cross-border better fit for the need of the patient. And of course, it's not only the facilitation, but it's also the facilitation of moving the patient. But it's good that the patient from Romania should go to Roma. But then what does it mean? It means travel, it means accommodation, it means the patient, it means the family, and not speaking about the language. So we need to figure out how really to help with the concept of navigator, really to facilitate families and implementation. It's one thing for a tumor board to say this patient would really should really move for this to this part of the European Union to get access to this trial or this treatment, and which is the implementation of all what it is to be done. So these are the proposals that we are making at the moment and really discussing at the EU level with a clear objective really to engage the member states. And this is why what's happening in the member states from their community is so important, because you have the contact with your state, with your government. But clearly the environment in Europe, or what we are doing, should really help you to tell your government that, yes, this is the momentum, how in your country you can really move forward. So this is what I wanted to share with you with the result of this OCEAN project. We developed childhood cancer country profiles. So if you go on the website of SciUp Europe, you will see a description of the childhood cancer profile for each of the different countries in the EU and the non-EU centers. And interestingly, what we have developed, this was what you were mentioning, the data were shared with the European Cancer Inequality Registries, because there was not much information there on childhood cancer. And if you go there, you will find some maps about availability of medicine, the topic of availability of clinical trial, which is of the European Cancer Inequality Registries. And in addition, when they did the second version of the cancer country profile, because you know that EU published for each country, well, what it is cancer in the country. In the first edition, there was nothing about childhood cancer. In the second edition, there is some information, which means that clearly telling the people, hey guys, here we are there are needs, and we can help you to provide the information that is relevant. So the information of the OCEAN program are now available as well in the Cancer Inequality Registry. So I would just to thank all the core team of the project, and this was run by the young SciOP, young pediatric oncologists, really dedicating to try to move forward, because it's not a classical research. You can say that it's policy research, whatever. It's not the phase 1 paper that will be published in Journal of Clinical Oncology. But then it's a way for them to understand what's happening and really to get engaged in making the point. Hey guys, for politicians, well, this is where we are. Well, we have an issue. Let's work on how to solve it. And these are all the people from all the countries, because the OCEAN project was run with people in each country, pediatric oncologists and parents from CCI Europe. And they all work to provide information, and this is all the people that we thank for them. And I thank you.
Great, thanks to you. What you do for this great initiative, and let's hope that we can push this forward. This is a very important point. For the sake of time, maybe we can leave questions for the discussion part and move forward with our next speaker. I will hand over. Which is Francisco Batista from Princess Maxima Center. He's a group leader in pediatric oncology drug development, and today he will tell us about the development of drugs in pediatric oncology with the aim towards safer and more effective medicines for children. Please.
Yeah, thank you, Anna, for your kind introduction. Well, you already introduced myself. Not sure.
Yeah, no, but you should not look at the screen.
Okay.
No, it's not.
So how can I move the slides? Because I see them moving here. Oh, now, sorry, that was a little bit of... now, before I'm going to present the content of my presentation, I thought it was important to show you what the principles of my activities are and the organizations I'm representing. So, as many of you, we have different hats. So these are my hats. I work for the Princess Maxima, I work for ITCC, I work for IBFM. Valls this morning mentions that we are not working only on slogans. We work on skills, we work on person. We have to deliver the objectives we are very nicely representing in our aims, our mission, our visions. So this is the missions, these are the aims of the organizations I work for. Of course, I'm affiliated to Princess Maxima, and the aim of the Princess Maxima is to cure every child with optimal quality of life. ITCC is advancing the introduction of new effective and safe therapies for children and adolescents with cancer, and also I work for IBFM in my position as chair of the IBFM Early Clinical Trial Group, where innovation and implementation of innovation in developing clinical trials, particularly for patients with children with hematological malignancies, is our main aim. So how can we combine these efforts, how we combine these slogans, how we can combine these aims into a single, common and concentrated effort? Now, I try to summarize everything into one single sentence, and I think the main issue, the beautiful thing of working together, all these organizations, is that together we can strive to cure our children with cancer and adolescents with cancer by driving the innovation through clinical trials, particularly in my field, early clinical trials, to bring safer and more effective therapies and ensure that every step improves both survival but also quality of life. So I think this is the beauty of working together with all these organizations working towards the same objective. And this is a nice introduction to what I'm going to tell you afterwards. So I will do a brief introduction. I wanted to illustrate the work of these organizations by giving a case, by giving an example of what we do in terms of clinical trials, and I will conclude with a few sentences trying to summarize what the content of my presentation today was. Now, already introduced by Anna, we know that in Europe, children represent between 15 to 20% of the population, but around 15,000 children are diagnosed with cancer every year, of which 3,500 unfortunately die. But it is a big issue because around 70% of the marketed drugs do not include any pediatric information. And this is a consequence of the historic development or not development of medicines specifically for children. This is not only in cancer, this is also for other pediatric conditions. I wanted to give the example of the Netherlands, where there are around 750 different drugs, and only half of those have somehow been properly investigated in children. So we are using a lot of medication for which verily there is no research done before for our patients. And this is a big problem because this leads us to three main consequences. Sorry, that went a little bit fast. We have to extrapolate safety and efficacy of the drugs that we are using from adults. There are no specific formulation for our patients, so our patients cannot take tablets, they cannot swallow certain medicines, so we cannot give those medicines unless we manipulate those. And of course, there is sometimes a limited interest of companies to develop specifically medicines for our children. We are seeing a change over time in the last few years. Particularly in the pediatric oncology fields, there is an increase in the number of biomarker-driven and targeted agents-focused trials, and this has also been reported and seen by the ITCC. But unfortunately, it takes a lot of time. So we have demonstrated and we show how much time it takes to implement clinical trials into practice, from the conception of the idea to the first patient included. And particularly, these times are longer by academic sponsors. Of course, pharma and pharmaceutical companies have much more support or more resources, but we, academics, feel an important gap in addressing the needs of our patients, and particularly academic trials have been successfully in the last few years addressing very critical, important needs in our population. We know that phase 3 trials are changing actually the current standard of care, but still early phase clinical trials deliver significant clinical benefit. And very recently, we demonstrated that they also improve quality of life. So we also need to change our mindset. Participating children in phase 1 clinical trials may also benefit not only from extended survival, but also to improve quality of life, symptoms, pain control, or other symptomatology. But as exemplified by Gilles, and this was the work from Teresa, a very little number of studies are open internationally or intercontinentally. And as already pointed out by Gilles, having access to clinical trials abroad your country remains a very important challenge. And lastly, there has been in the last few years a very active group led by Accelerate in collaboration with ITCC, LifeArc, trying to bring all the involved stakeholders into the single room to make medicines available for children in a more rapid way, in particularly in the field of pediatric oncology. So ITCC, and this slide was shown already by Gilles in the keynote presentation, was created in 2003 with the aim of developing novel therapies in collaboration with academics, industry, and patients advocates. It is currently constituted by 68 European sites across different 18 countries, and we are 7 international academic sponsors. And I wanted to stop here a little bit. There is no more information in these slides. Academic international sponsors of the ITCC sponsor studies across Europe, and most of them are academically driven. But we also work closely with companies. We want companies to address particularly the needs of our patients, and we, through the ITCC, advise companies how to develop the right trial for the right medicine. So we don't want simple pharma-driven studies that are not really pointing out to the needs of our patients. So in this very close collaboration, sponsors of the ITCC really try to pull the interest of companies to divert the interest to the real needs of our patients. There is also a strong research background with 25 European laboratories engaged in both preclinical and translational research, and is an international network which is recognized by the IMPRIMA. We do also things to try to favor the access to clinical trials, and this is the committee I'm chairing, the sponsor committee, which we aim for working and contributing into the equity of access to innovation for children and adolescents with cancer. And these are our 3 pillars. We are working on this strategy now for 2 years, and I just wanted to show you a few examples of things that we are doing. We work closely with SIOPE for the cross-border access. We are also trying to harmonize eligibility criteria to make accessible clinical trials and don't impose ourselves unnecessary barriers to include patients by putting eligibility criteria that are not really needed. And we are also intensively working, and we submitted our manuscript recently in collaboration with Accelerate, how we can implement in practice the centralized clinical trial elements to favor access of patients to clinical trials that do not live in the city where the study is open, or even more in the country where the study is open. We are also working on strengthening our collaboration. We work internationally with Australia and Canada because they face similar problems that we do, and we wanted also to engage and produce harmonized concepts and harmonized actions together with them. And we are also realizing that as a network, we are not perfect. We need to improve. We need to find out where our issues are, where our challenges are. So one of the things we are intensively working at is how to improve the functionality of the network to engage well with our partners and ultimately favoring the patients' access into clinical trials. Now I'm going to give you 3 examples of 3 different sponsors from the ITCC network and focused on different aspects. Now, the first one I wanted to show is the example of bosutinib and intusumab. These are 2 ITCC studies. I probably know that you are already familiar with these compounds, but I will briefly introduce this concept. So inotuzumab is a monoclonal ADC, monoclonal antibody drug conjugate, anti-CD22, which is expressed universally in most of the B-ALL cells. And this is linked to kalikeamicin, which is a cytotoxic compound. Upon binding of the monoclonal antibody to the cell, it releases the cytotoxic component, goes and lysates the lysosomes, and favors the death of the cells. On the right side, you can see the mechanism of action of bosutinib or other tyrosine kinase inhibitors, but I wanted to show particularly this one. So bosutinib is a focused, a specific target drug against SCR and BCR-ABL, and upon binding to the ATP binding component of the cells, of the tyrosine kinase, it favors the dephosphorylation and ultimately the apoptosis of the cells, favoring the control of the disease. Next slide shows what the long story of these studies are. I'm not going to focus on the details of the two pictures because they are too busy, but I want to bring your attention to some dates. ITCC 054 is one study which was focused on bosutinib, and as you can see here, the first development of the drug started almost 20 years ago. It was not until somewhere mid-20s, around 2016, when 2019 actually, when we could start the ITCC study, the bosutinib development of this compound in children. So it took already around 13 years from the first studies done in adults to the first study done in children, and it took still 6 years to complete, or 4 years to complete the clinical trial, and fortunately this was one of the studies where bosutinib was, the conception of the study was an intent to file from the beginning, so with the intention of getting a indication for this compound with all the preparation and the scrutiny of such a trial in collaboration with Pfizer, and fortunately this study resulted successful, and the drug is now approved both in the FDA and both at EMA, which is ultimately what we want. We want to deliver clinical trials which release reliable data, which can be used by the authorities to get a label that we can prescribe this medication to our patients in our hospital. So we don't need to use off-label or compassionate use programs. So similarly, the ITCC 059, the first experiment with this drug and the first clinical trials started early in the 20s. It was not until 2016 when we opened this study in a few countries in Europe, and it's not been until 2024 when the FDA approved all the package, all the regulatory package delivered by this compound or by this clinical trial to get a label for inotuzumab in North America. So just a few conclusions out of these studies, a few reflections. So it took almost 20 years in the initiation of the studies in adults to start to get the approval in our patients. It takes around 7 to 8 years before the drug is approved to the approval of the condition in children, and it has a lot of cost because opening these clinical trials takes a lot of time. These were very large international trials, one intercontinental with the COG as a partner in the North America, but the drug is yet not approved in all regions despite all the efforts. Once it is approved by the authorities, it has to go to the health technology agencies in the countries, and then you can prescribe this medicine for your patients. Despite the impressive results, we saw by this study, similar to our or similar to other partners who are also developing these compounds, with complete remission rates of 80% in otherwise uncurable patients. So this is really the type of study we want to do, and the meaningful results they deliver to our patients. Particularly important for patients with CML is a very rare condition in children, but they suffer from the negative side effects of impairment in growth. So by developing new medicines, like for instance bosutinib, we have shown that at least in the first year of treatment, there is no impact on growth in those patients. This was presented last year in IHA. Of course, this needs a little bit more follow-up, but it's not only developing effective medicines, but also medicines that affect less to the intrinsic development elements of children at a very early age. I wanted also to highlight one study. I'm very proud of this. This is the ISMAR study, which is led by Birgit Ingustad-Roussy. This is a nice story as well. I had the opportunity to work with Jill and with Birgit when I was in Paris for a few years. And at that time, back in 2012, there was this Moscato molecular profiling project, and this was one of the first efforts to provide molecular data for patients at the time of relapse. But we were confronted with a few questions. Out of the reports of these manuscripts, we could find some molecular alterations that may be targetable by some drugs in around 60% of those patients. but also we got questions from the parents, is there not any treatment available? And that was shocking for the doctors, because in only around 20% of the patients, we could really find a drug that could be linked to the molecular alteration of the patient. So this drove the efforts to developing such a clinical trial, and there were also questions like, for instance, do we need to biopsy the patient? What the benefit of biopsying a patient at the stage, at the very advanced stage, is if we are not going to be able to deliver anything to the patient. So I had the big opportunity to participate in FLIMS back in 2014, which is now called MCCR. And this is me with Birgit Asides, and we there developed the concept of eSmart, which is basically a complex clinical trial, a platform clinical trial, which is tumor biology driven, constituted by phase 1, phase 2 components, and there is a common protocol structure and similar objectives, endpoints, and future deliverables that apply to all sub-protocols. Very impressively, the team from Gustave Roussy has been able to deliver all these arms. I'm not going to go into detail because this is very complex, but these were major pathways altered in cancer, in different types of cancer in children, for which there were agreements between academia and companies to deliver these compounds into clinical trials addressed to patients who presented with very specific alterations. This is a major effort from the team. This data we published end of last year, and this is only to show you how graphically this evolved. And it's very impressive. I was a little bit complaining before how much time we academics take to deliver clinical trials, but this is particularly an exception of this, because out of all these different clinical trials, out of all these different sub-protocols, we were able to deliver quite quickly. There have been, until the time of publication, more than 250 patients included in 16 arms in 6 countries, which is remarkable. And the median time to complete recruitment was only 1.5 years, which is also remarkable for this kind of very complex clinical trial. So academics, we can really do well things when we are now well prepared and very committed to the objectives. This represents also the way we work in ITCC. So the international sponsor, in this case Gustave Roussy, is the main responsible for delivering, implementing, and setting up the study. But this relies enormously on the NCCs, or the National Coordinating Centers, which are ultimately responsible for opening the studies in their own countries. They act as country legal responsible entity. They are also responsible for contracting the different sites. And also the beauty of this study is that there are quite a few sites open in those countries, but there is a big engagement from the sites up to the sponsor to deliver and to think and to consider new protocols, so that eSmart remains open and alive. And the last example I wanted to show you, something is not, now, a little bit before. One other example is the collaboration we have with IBFM and ITCC, with these two platforms for discussing patients which are very complex, and these are the federal and the ILTB projects. So these are ways to enhance access to expert opinion in pediatric hemato-oncology. So these are platforms for discussion with experts of very complex patients. So it's to bring the expertise to the doctor who is wherever in Europe, and they have very complex patients, and they have to discuss this instead of sending emails to everybody. So you can have all the experts you need in one round, in one meeting, and discuss those patients and try to get what the best option for those patients is. So both platforms are currently open. I have to say you that we are in the process of merging these two platforms so that there is only one platform in Europe for those type of patients, not only ALL, but also hematological conditions. So we are in the process of coming together. And now this is to exemplify how successful these approaches are, with more than 130 cases discussed from 2023 out of 26 countries, including Latvia, federal 113 cases, including 20 countries. And also it's remarkable that out of the decision of this tumor war, patients are receiving a letter that can be used also to engage with the authorities in the country to favor, for instance, access to clinical trials in other countries. So this is also something that can be used for favoring cross-border access and access to clinical trial in other countries. Lastly, we are also working to incorporate artificial intelligence with the Capricorn tool that is also available now in collaboration with Google and led by my colleagues Uri, Ilan, and this is also helping on top of the expertise of the regular people to provide advice to the clinicians. These are my conclusions, nothing different from what I told before. Clinical trials are really the way forward to offer new opportunities for our patients. As I have exemplified, international collaboration is crucial. We cannot do it ourselves, and there is a critical role of academia and patients advocates to identify what the real needs of our patients are and work closely with regulators and companies to try to bring these medicines more effectively into our patients. Thank you so much to the organizing team of this fabulous meeting, all my colleagues in the different organizations I work for, peers and investigators, and of course all of you for your attention. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Oops. Thank you very much, Paco, for this extremely well describing all the issues. Interestingly, if I may, the two examples you gave of bosutinib and inotuzumab, with such long delay in between first approval in adults and first approval in children, not yet in Europe for inotuzumab, is really a problem of implementation of the pediatric regulation. Because here we are exactly the same disease, because both are addressing a disease which is occurring in adults and children. So by the regulation, this long delay should not have happened, which is a different situation of what we saw in our solid tumors, where the relevant drug was important for pediatric malignancies, not for where the adult cancer is not existing in children. So it's another example of how the pediatric regulation in Europe were not implemented in the right way and explaining all the issues that you are describing. Sorry, I was jumping on that because it was an important. And this is why we need to have this package really addressing the clear needs of the patient. And you all know that the pharmaceutical package is being negotiated at the moment in Europe, in the Parliament, in the Council, and the Commission, and will come up with a revision of this regulation. And clearly the intention is good. And this is where we need to be very continuing, focusing on that. Sorry for that. So the next speaker, because we keep the question, even though I made some comments, sorry for that. The next speaker is Karsten Nissen. This is you, Karsten. Yeah, this is you. Senior consultant, MD, PhD, head of clinical trials unit for children and adolescents with cancer in Copenhagen, a very active member of ITCC and really active in the NOFO environment, really to bring innovation for children with cancer. So, Karsten, the title of your talk is on the screen. Yeah. Clinical trials for newly diagnosed and relapsed childhood cancer in the Nordic and Baltic country regions, how to improve. You have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Gilles, for the kind introduction. Thank you for the organizers for inviting me to come here. I think you're now witnessing sort of a boil down or a getting more and more specific, because this morning in the main hall you heard Gilles giving the big overview of precision cancer medicine. Earlier here in this session you heard him talk about precision cancer medicine for children at a policy level. That's really where Gilles is investing a lot of time in addition to many other things he's also invested in. And then Paco took it to the delivery at the European level, and now I'll try to be the more regional one, because talking about the Nordic and Baltic aspect. So just a little about my background. It was very long ago, a very young doctor by coincidence hit pediatric cancer, which I was quite convinced I was not going to end up in, but that's how it went. It was a fascinatingly complex and fascinatingly friendly environment and very meaningful. I then did my PhD on late effects, the first cohort of kids that survived in our part of the region. Then specialized and was actually in charge of our brain tumor team for about a decade. So I have a special heart for the brain tumors, which you might remember were one of the underserved population as for the trials in kids. And then since 2012, I've been allocated and working full-time to build up a phase 1-2 trials unit in Copenhagen as the first one in the Nordic region. And I do believe it's as part of that that I'm invited here today. So I'll try to make some general comments about things. Why is it it's so important to get the trials? Because in reality, what we need is approved treatments for the kids, and that would be the good one. But we need the trials because they are supporting us in standardizing the treatment we are giving our children. And we use the trials to take our current standard and compare with our suggested next improvement to see if we really have good ideas or whether we should reject them and come up with a better one to compare with. And there are many advantages of participating in clinical trials. They have been mentioned earlier already, but for many decades, there were statistics supporting that, for example, in the US, children treated on a clinical trial had a better survival than ones not being on a clinical trial. Now, in the wealthiest and best developed parts of the world, nowadays, that's maybe not true anymore because standards have been becoming very high. But in regions where things are still to be optimized, it's for sure a way of structuring your approach to the workup of the patient and the treatment of the patient. Among other things, this includes you get a network, you get a lot of standards for how you do the workup and the assessments. Once you begin treating the child on a protocol or a trial, you have guidelines. If they have so much tox, you should decrease the pressure. If they have these challenges, you should stop and check with the leaders of the trial. So there's a lot of learning in participating in a trial. And then, not least, the investigators get a network with the other ones in the country for the bigger countries, otherwise in the region and at often European-wide or even beyond at a global level. And by participating in the trial, also importantly, you contribute to developing and improving the treatment for the child coming after years if you're a parent or a patient. The story in the Nordic region and later extended to the Baltics with the fall of the Iron Curtain and the Baltic countries being associated with the Nordic network since 1992 or 3, was initially a collaboration about leukemias. So there was an established of the Nordic Society of Paediatric Hematology, or NOFO. That's the home ground for people like Anna and myself. I tend to say in my country, Denmark, someone treating a frequent disease, they'll have a professional network within their country. But in pediatric oncology, of course, there are a few other centers, but my main family tends to be the Nordic-Baltic one. And now where I spent a decade in the experimental therapies, it's actually more the European one, or even the European, North American, global one. The Nordic efforts were mainly on leukemia, whereas for the tumors sitting in the brain or the CNS, as well as outside, it was always participating in European trials or even wider trials. And then from the 2013, we got the first member of this ITCC network that you just heard about for the experimental therapies in Copenhagen, and subsequently centers have come to the 4 big Nordic countries. It's not every time I hit the button, right? No. So clinical trials in the Nordic Baltic region, before Gilles presented a search based on the clinicaltrials.gov homepage, which is a US-based one, and that used to be the place where doctors went to look for a trial, as well as where the parents went. And the backdrop of that page is a lot of trials are registered there. Ideally, they are updated, but very often they are not, in particular not the European ones. And we actually got a new resource not so long ago where, with the new regulation in Europe, the CETIS system, or the clinical trial regulation, we can actually search that. And I checked, it is rather complete as for what is approved in the countries. And since it was only opened a year ago, this database, I tried to look at what is actually open or approved for any level of trial in a childhood cancer in each of the Nordic countries. And you can see there's something going on in all the 4 Nordic countries, but in the Baltics, it's still a challenge. Estonia has 3 trials open, 1 for ALL and then 2 closely linked trials for AML. Latvia has the AML trials open. You mentioned yesterday in a workshop you also have another one open, but that's a registry, so it's not in this database, but it's a renal tumor registry, which is very meaningful to join. And Lithuania, the biggest of the 3 Baltic, and the ones who went further earlier on, have 6 approved trials. Altogether in the Nordic region, we get close to 90, and just for a comparison, you saw that a lot of things are going on in France and in Spain, and you can see that France, Spain, it's approaching 130, so about 2/3 of those are open somewhere or approved somewhere in the Nordic region. So as a region, if we're not 8 small countries, but if you lumped us together, we are not that bad. It's not ideal, but there's something going on. And then when you get to experimental therapies, of course, things get even more diverse between the countries, where within the region we have 32 different things available, of which significant fractions are open in Norway and Sweden, and a lot by us in Copenhagen, but very little in the Baltic states, the exception being Lithuania participating in a nuclear medicine trial for relapsed neuroblastoma. So how to improve that access was my task for today. And I think that can be considered in 3 different ways. Firstly, the place where we can probably make the biggest difference for a country like Latvia or the 2 other Baltic states is probably in the frontline setting, because this conference is about personalized medicine and precision medicine, but also the frontline treatment of many cancers are now personalized treatment. It's not always the thing you sequence the tumor or the cancer or the leukemia, you find the target, you use the drug, and then it's all settled. But leukemia treatment is so personalized in the sense that you stratify up front based on the characteristics of the disease. You modify treatment along the way, depending on exactly how the child responds to the treatment, by this marker, by that marker. Some of them are clinical, some of them are molecular, but they are very personalized, and that is personalized medicine at its best. So getting involved in that, implementing that, improving that, I think is where a country like Latvia can make the biggest difference for the ones that is important, namely the patients and their relatives. This, as mentioned by Gilles and others, is virtually all, it tends to be phase 3, it can also be called phase 2, and it's virtually all academic. These days we have 2 trials open in Denmark for newly diagnosed cancers, one being for low-grade gliomas, something called Firefly-2, and another one for high-grade gliomas, where Lilly is exploring a combination of new agents for consolidation in glioblastomas. But all the rest is driven by the academic community. So it's about opening the trials quickly, And to that end, we also discussed yesterday in a workshop in the hospital, don't try to open that trial that is about to close next year, because you'll invest as much time on opening that as on opening the trial next to it, which might be running for 5 years, and where you can then get more learning, you can get more involvement, pick the fresh ones. Try to offer the trials to all the relevant candidates, and I know you might have logistics. You're lucky here, you have one cancer center, so as such it's easy. Sometimes there can be trials opening not everywhere, but you might have, I mean, in my country we have a lot of immigrants. I know the colleagues in Sweden, they had an influx from Syria where I think they increased their population by about 10%. You don't have a consent form in Arab hanging around, and doctors have problems producing a consent form in Arabic. You probably don't have the same, but I know you have a significant Russian language population where maybe consent forms are not available as well, or at least you need to translate between languages. Comply with the protocol, use the reference evaluations, contribute actively, and then get involved in developing the next trial. That's where you really get into the matter, and where you get part of this community and end up having the people you work with considered close colleagues and often friends like the ones I'm hanging out with here in this session today. Preferably, of course, that frontline treatment should be in the home country, and mostly it is the case. It's rare to have referrals abroad, but it does happen. For example, the BioMedi trial, that was a trial for the terrible brain tumor, the diffuse midline glioma or the pontine gliomas, which is still considered virtually incurable, was a major improvement in Europe, established and sponsored by the Gustave Roussy team, so Gilles' home ground, and that was initially opened in France and then later taken to our country, subsequently to Sweden, but still not open in all the countries in the region, so it might be worth discussing the possibility of referral with a family if they have a strong wish for treatment. Not because it's nice to go abroad when you have a child with a very serious condition, but rather be referred abroad for a very rational and scientifically sound trial than for going for some magician having a clinic somewhere where you can waste your money and your time and not, I mean, I'm sure you'll feel taken care of because they tend to manage that, but it won't be sensible in many, many other ways. So it is, but it should be an open discussion because still we can't guarantee cure. We can guarantee anything but cure in that situation. Then that was the front line. The next thing is the second line, where there's still there are some trials around, for example, for relapsed ALL. ALL is the most frequent childhood leukemia. For those of you who are not childhood pediatric oncologists, it's like 80% of the childhood leukemia. It's a high cure rate disease, but still some patients die from it. So there are some like structured approaches to the relapse patients there. And they are also increasingly being involved, the relapse approaches being included in the frontline trials, at least in Europe. For example, the frontline neuroblastoma trial now has a cohort for what do you do if they don't respond properly in the first place. The FARMS trial is one for rhabdomyosarcoma, so a soft tissue sarcoma for kids, which also has a recommendation for a relapse treatment, and until recently had a randomized question with a pharma contributor there. And there are often fewer centers opening that, but still quite well rolled out within Europe, although not everywhere. And then you're getting towards some specialized indications, like, for example, as I mentioned here, the CAR T-cell therapy, that's cell-based immunotherapy, or for a relapsed leukemia, you'd often need a hematopoietic stem cell transplant. That's also not available in every center, and it's such a complex thing and a potentially high-risk thing that it shouldn't be. So there'll be referrals often within country. I know in this region, or in Latvia, it happens between countries, which I think is wise because you collaborate with the colleagues in Vilnius about doing that to get a proper volume in this region for that. And there are less relevant open trials in Europe than for the frontline setting. And then we come to the sort of the relapsed. It's not a frequently used word, but now that I had a header on the relapse, then we get to sort of the ones where we are beyond what we could consider standard, or whether there's an agreement, where there's no longer an agreement in the community, what should you do next or after that? Or it could be the ones who turn out to be refractory, it won't go away in the first setting. That's when first, if you're not already my hair, then your hair begins getting gray, or you pull it and you get increasingly bald. And that's down to the phase 1-2 thing. And about half of that is still investigator-initiated in childhood cancer. And that's only in dedicated centers, and many patients would therefore have to travel if a significant fraction of the trial population should participate. For a few conditions, there's a big hope, like we heard this morning about the larotrectinib drug, which made a huge difference. But one should be sobered that usually this is experimental. It's fascinating due to this high complexity, but again, it's a lot of work for very few patients. For example, we have 29 trials open in Copenhagen, and this year until now we enrolled 11 patients. So we have a lot of trials just kept ready for that next one. So how to improve that access? I think things to consider is to improve on decentralized elements of clinical trials. That's a new work at the European level. It's about some parts of a trial. Sometimes a whole trial can be done at home, so to speak, or with virtual connection, never in childhood cancer care, but maybe part of the trial could actually happen at another center through a video consultation or just a collaboration. When you get cross-border, delicate, they say, because if someone is sitting in this country and I'm in charge of the trial in Copenhagen, am I breaking the Latvian law by handling? That's to come, but still it's an interesting tendency, and we should try to improve that. And then I think you should gradually increase your clinical trial conduct ability or capacity and establish a clinical trials unit. And where I'm based, our story was we established first the early phase trials, and then later we found out the frontline trials were really getting open too late, and it was getting increasingly complex for my colleagues to open their trials to do the submission. So then we took it on board. But I would recommend starting the other way around in a country like this. And there's something about getting money and finding colleagues to learn from, and then to motivate key members to do it. And refer to another country or center. It's suboptimal, but on the other hand, one shouldn't believe that everything can be done everywhere. And remember, it is experimental. I think I'll go to the clinical trials unit thing, which was really I think in the title of my talk. I think what you need there, you need for sure, you need people. You need people with a lot of dedication. You need money for protected space. It's very little about space. I mean, you need to have a chair to sit on and a wall to hang some where you can store all the binders, but it's not some magical room. It's not a new machine. It's very much about what is inside the people you work with. Then you need some time, because it takes a terrible lot of time. The only thing really about your equipment is that it needs to be certified now and then by your technical department, usually. I can't think of the machine we got to the hospital just because of clinical trials. It's about getting the machines checked now and then. And what a clinical trial looks like, therefore, because people and dedication is key, is this, which is the team I chair now in Copenhagen. And this is a clinical trials team doing mostly phase 1-2, but also the frontline trials. And you see we have several doctors, we're a lot of study nurses. And then we have 2 regulatory specialists, whom I actually, forgot here. I think that's what the photo was used for an inspection of an industry trial, because they are very key. We have 2 colleagues working full-time to support doctors in submitting trials, to keep trials updated, to prepare consent forms. And the frontline part of our team is composed of this, and this gives you an idea of how many people you need. For comparison, Denmark, 6 million people, 4 cancer centers, so you can probably not go down to 25% of that, because then the doctor really gets chopped into small pieces. But you get an idea of the volume. A bit of doctor, a lot of regulatory specialist, which is initially trained by the doctor because no one knows it from the beginning. And then a bit of administration, and then a lot of the resources we get for the national unit is then distributed out to the centers, so that when my regulatory specialists support a doctor sitting in Aarhus, the other Danish center, on opening a trial, that doctor get money for being brought free from clinical duties for 2 weeks' time to review and to do all the things needed for that, as well as when they enroll a patient on a trial in that center, they get reimbursement of part of a nurse's pay for that. And that is our national foundation, and I threw in numbers, not to do it overly specific, but it gives you an idea of the order of magnitude. I know staff costs here will be hopefully lower, and I believe they are significantly lower, but this is the type of money you should try to get out of your foundation. Or others, it could be government funding this effort or whatever. And with that, I think I ended the story moving from oncopolicy this morning down to the very specific Nordic and Baltic, and looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Carsten. Right in time. So now we have time for questions from you and for discussion. I think this is one of the best parts of such lectures. So let's meet in front and have a seat there and continue the discussion. I'm in the middle. So maybe let's share the microphones. Yeah, like that. I can start with a question, maybe, if I'm allowed to. So my first question goes to Gilles. May I ask about the statistics you showed about the availability of the trials and this discrepancy in inequalities? Did you also see in this data if this was the main bulk of these 436 trials was phase 3, or were there rather really early trials that were making this whole count? So is the problem more really about these frontline therapies and clinical trials in these which are not equally available, or is this rather about these trials, phase 1, phase 2, which are in, we saw Germany, France, Spain were the leading countries, and Nordic and maybe Eastern Europe were less?
So 2/3 of this 436 trials, which were in 2010 to 2022, which, by the way, Carsten, is ahead of the updates from the CTIS, showing the experience. But from this, 2/3 were late phase trial and 1/3. And clearly, if you look at the number of trials in the Central Europe, it's none on very few of them. So we cannot say it's mainly phase 1 or mainly phase 3, it's any. And I think the message today is that if we look at the portfolio of trials in Europe for childhood cancer, you have on one side, as described by Carsten, the phase 3 trial for newly diagnosed patients. And these are 95% of them academic. There is no industry there. And we are struggling to get some new drugs to introduce frontline with the company because they don't want. So this really should be really considered how to make this open in more countries in Europe. And the message from Karsten and the building of this clinical trial unit is very much an effort in the country to invest in creating such infrastructure, which is related to the concept of childhood cancer infrastructure I was developing further. And then you do have the early phase 1 and phase 1-2 trial, where there is innovative drugs with more industry trials. In ITCC, it's about 60% industry trial and 40% academic trial. Where clearly the innovation here for patients with a relapsed malignancies with no standard of care to provide them cure. And as mentioned by both Paco and Karsten, this phase 1 and phase 1-2 trial cannot be open in all centers. Because it's an issue of number of patients, it's an issue of capability, because you don't run a phase 1 trial as you run a phase 3 trial in a clinical unit. This is why we built ITCC. And Paco insisted that there are 68 centers in ITCC, but not all 68 centers get the first in-child trial. So there is a graduation from this very first in-child trial with a new compound down to the phase 3. And this is why regarding access to innovation in the relapse setting for children in Europe, because at the end our goal is that this child with a non-curative pediatric malignancy should be offered the opportunity to get access to innovation. Scientifically sound, medically feasible, and so on. But this should not be, okay, we don't have access, so you will not have access. So the idea very much is to think each child in Europe should be given the option and the parents to say yes or no. Because clearly crossing border to participate to a phase 1 trial in a country where you don't speak the language is not something easy. So these early phase trials are necessarily open in a limited number of centers. And this is where we need to improve our capacity for identifying in all the country where the patient is in the center at the time of relapse, if there would be somewhere an ongoing trial that would be relevant for this patient, especially when there is a biomarker and the targeted drug in the phase 1 trial, and then set up the capability for this child, after discussing with the family, really to be moved into an investigating centers. And by this way, we would see more phase 3 trials open in the Central Europe, better access to this, which is an issue of academic trial and how to strengthen this. And second, better access for children and adolescents with relapsed malignancies to the innovation than it is at the moment, just to reduce the inequalities across Europe. But what's happening in Central Europe is no phase 3, no phase 1, mainly.
Maybe you have questions. Now is the time for you to ask. You don't remember anymore the questions. Well, exactly, you brought it to the point, and this is of great importance. But do you think if everyone succeeds with pushing through oceans and through the European Commission to enable S2 forms more for clinical trials, may there be? Do you expect challenges of capacity for the ITCC centers, which then through S2 forms have more requests for transferring patients? Do you expect that this could be a new challenge? Probably.
So I would say at the moment that it's not a capacity issue. No. Clearly, the goal is how to make this trial more accessible for more patients. Roughly by year, it's about 350 or 400 patients, including in ITCC trials. And again, it's not in the 68 institutions. So clearly, this is not an issue of capacity on our side. It's really an issue about facilities, structuring at the member state level, the capability, exactly what you are doing here. by taking the objective to create a clinical trial unit, was invested with people. And it was said by both Paco and by Carsten. There's a need for resources, people and so on. And then figure out what you can get, and really setting up a program how really to give access to your patient in the country when it is relevant for a given trial. So I think you are really on the right way, but building the capability, because we can get anything from Europe if the member state is not supporting this initiative in the centers. Why is it working in France? Why? Well, because we have a National Cancer Institute. We have been pushing for them to consider the need of childhood cancer, and they supported infrastructure. And that's the key thing. It's good to have trials, it's good to have projects, but you need infrastructure. And clearly, they created, for example, the CLIP. CLIP is a centre labellisé of early phase trial for children. So there are centers identified, qualified, and receive some funding to really support the implementation of phase 1 trial. So it's a help of the member states in the infrastructure. And this is what is the most difficult, because in European project, usually you do have a project from A to Z, and then you try to get it sustainable on the long term. But clearly this is really the goal, infrastructure. And this is the same in the UK. They created the European Experimental Clinical Medicine Centers, which is funded by CR UK, providing resources for centers to implement research and clinical trials. And this is what you are doing at the moment, really identifying. And I think this is a key message. Charities don't like to fund infrastructure. They like to fund projects and say, well, we will cure more children. Yes, but this need of infrastructure is absolutely essential.
Yeah, if I may add to that, actually, we apply to the Childhood Cancer Foundation in Denmark every year to have them fund this National Clinical Trials Unit. And they are semi-reluctant, and one of our arguments is if our children in Denmark are not participating in and being treated according to the newest trials, which are open in Europe, how can all the biological and basic research that the same foundation is funding as well, how can that be meaningful if you're like doing biology based on outdated treatment approaches? So it's necessary to be at the forefront for the biology to be meaningful, because for example, a leukemia not responding to the frontline treatment, if it's an old-fashioned one given in an outdated way, is not at all the same as the leukemia not responding to the newest treatment, like being given at the best institutions. So try convince the foundations to support it, at least as a kick-off, and then maybe you'll be out fundraising from other sources later on. And despite this is precision medicine, focus on the frontline therapies. That's where one example, Lithuania was the first Baltic country to actively participate in the frontline Nordic leukemia protocol, and that data supported they just about doubled the survival rate by joining that. You're probably, I hope, because you've been involved with us for so many years in the Nordic community, you are hopefully at a better level, but again, you can make a big difference there. And most of the experimental therapies we offer provide hope, evidence, development, but most of them don't provide cure, to be honest.
Yes, thank you, absolutely. Yeah, a question from the audience, please.
Okay, thank you. Very interesting discussion, and maybe coming back to your, a bit like to your comment on basic research and cancer research and how it interacts. So I'm not a clinician, I'm a researcher, biochemist, but we work a lot with the functional precision medicine and patient-derived cancer cell models in the drug testing side, and so on. So I would like to ask your opinion in the clinical trials, like how much should we actually involve and even increase this type of the crosstalk also of the new kind of innovative ways to do the better diagnosis, better, maybe better kind of prediction of the possible treatments for the patients, and bring this type of the knowledge to the clinical trials. As we know, it's now quite a lot of regulation on this way. And for example, it's not easy to kind of apply some of the new diagnostic methods to kind of bring them up to the clinical trials. So that at least we feel is a big challenge, although we think that there would be a lot of promises. So maybe you can a bit comment on that.
No, your point is important because we have been discussing all this morning about clinical trial to enroll patient. The type of clinical trial, but not exactly the content. Then you go up and say, okay, there is a new drug in development. Is it relevant or not for children? And you go up even further, which is, okay, there is a lot of science in the research labs identifying new targets which are potentially relevant. How we're sure there would be drug development. And this is why all the additional activities regarding preclinical model, regarding exploiting data we have generated are so important to make the decision on what drug should be moved forward. And this is the issue at the moment. As I mentioned, since 2007, there is in Europe a pediatric regulation. Pediatric regulation was saying, well, a drug in an adult cancer or an adult disease will not be developed in children if this disease does not occur in children. Lung cancer in adult does not occur in children. Well, ACK inhibition is relevant for lung cancer, but for anaplastic large cell lymphoma and neuroblastoma. So this was the spirit, okay? And then we look at where we are. Paco showed that for blinatumomab and bosutinib, exactly the same disease. It took up to 20 years from first in adults and first in child, and even more, most of the work has been done by academia and not by industry. So we have a failure there. And on the other hand, there has been many drugs that we've been waived for development to the industry because the adult condition does not exist in children. Well, clearly academia said, we have strong biological rationale. So academic trial, academic information, and finally, approval. So this is where we need to make some consistency in what we're, and the consistency comes, where is the science? What do we know from the pediatric patient tumors to really define the relevance of developing a drug in adults and children or pushing for startup biotech to invest on that? And this is exactly the point you are making. Really, how can we generate sufficient information that the drugs entering development in children really have a strong biological and scientific rationale? Because there have been trials developed that was not so relevant, you know? And the issue of the Me Too drugs, you know? You have a company with a first-in-class drug, well, first on the market, and when the market is large, poof, many companies do Me Too drugs. Well, different, but very likely drugs, similar drug. And then, by the regulation, all of them should consider pediatric malignancies or pediatric development, which is nonsense as well. So the key point is how to make some consistency, science-driven, medical need of the patient-driven pediatric development plan to assure that the drug entering development in children will really be the one too. But on the other side, all what we have been discussing this morning, how to improve the capability in Europe to provide access to the patient to this development. The early drug and the phase 3 trials. And the phase 3 trial is really the issue at the moment. Let's take Kymriah, the first ever CD19 CAR T-cell for the treatment of acute lymphoblastic leukemia. A major breakthrough. And Emilia, the child from the memorial, is really alive, a beautiful adolescent, first treated by CAR T-cell. Development by the company, Novartis. Development and first authorization, approved in Europe and in the US for the treatment of CD19 leukemias, children, adolescents, and young adults. It was in relapse. The first child was treated in the third or fourth or even fifth relapse. Well, necessarily, you have this approved in the relapse setting. You want to move this front line and to say how this can help improving cure of children with highly, I don't find the word, aggressive leukemias, front line. With the key question, allogenic bone marrow transplantation versus CAR T cell, which is a real question. The company never wanted to move frontline. Because then they did their obligation with regard to the PIP, and the regulation doesn't say, well, if you have a drug in the relapse setting approved, you should also continue to evaluate that in the frontline setting, which is what companies do in adults. What a company is doing, rushing clinical trial in the relapse setting to get the first approval in lung cancer, in breast cancer, in the relapse setting. But immediately they move in the frontline setting because the market is much larger in newly diagnosed patients than in the relapse setting, since there are more and more patients cured. So this natural way of developing medicine is not implemented in the field of childhood cancer. And this is where clearly academic trial and support will be there. If we are expecting companies in the next 10 years to invest more in the frontline setting for their drug, we will not hit the needs. And this is why academic trial, regulatory fit for purpose, with this compound in the frontline setting will be the only way to see if this new medicine, CAR T, ADCs, immunotherapy, new targeted compounds, can really change the outcome of newly diagnosed patients with a very, very dismal prognosis with regard to the tumor. So this is where clearly the role of academia is so important. And this is why opening these phase 3 trials in Central Europe makes sense, because if you have more centers, you go quickly. Okay? And then you address the point made by Paco. It takes what? 1, 2, 3, 4 years from a concept to a first patient in. So we need to facilitate that, but also we need to take less time to implement the phase 3 trial. This is why it makes sense that all the Central Europe centers and the light colors in the map really should be in the next years, more colored, because clearly clinical trial, especially the phase 3, would be available there. Paco, please.
Maybe to come back to your comment how biologists and clinicians can work better together and try to identify the right medicines for... Yeah. Yeah, so I just want to exemplify this with a recent discussion we have had. You may know that there is one BCL2 inhibitor only approved in adults, which is venetoclax. The company is not willing anymore to develop any more clinical trial in children. They are not also giving any more drug because they are focused on their intent to file study. But there is an increasing need of implementing these BCL2 inhibitors in pediatric conditions. So we are now in a position that we, with many other companies which are developing new BCL2 inhibitors, but they are developing these compounds only for adult conditions. They don't do any experimental studies, any preclinical research in pediatric conditions, but still there is a need to develop these compounds in children. So this is actually where ITCC or academics and biologists can work together to try to find the place and the right studies for these medications in the right conditions in children, and then develop these medications further into clinical trials. I mean, we shouldn't fail again doing very beautiful studies with compounds that are either not available anymore because they are off patent or they are not developed anymore, and trying to focus on what is actually the need, where our needs are, and trying to work closely with our clinicians to develop the right preclinical studies and then move rapidly into clinical studies. and not only on the relapse refractory setting, but also trying to bring these medications forward to the front line. And if you see example of the venetoclax in combination with azacitidine, this is so rapidly moving into a less aggressive induction chemotherapy for patients with AML, that why we shouldn't also apply this in children and try to get rid of all the complication of cardiotoxicity, sepsis, and things like this. So we need this approach also in our studies.
Thank you. I think we need to wrap up now because there is another session going. Thank you for your great talks and for this great discussion, and looking forward to next developments.